block the microphone. There we go.
It sounds perfect. Hey, thank
Yeah.
you so much for joining me and joining Jaxsta on our live stream. Where about you're in your studio at the moment?
I'm in my wee studio in Los Angeles. Little streaming setup there. So yeah, this is one of those classic LA houses that actually we found when we moved down here, and one of the rooms is being converted into a mastering suite. So it had this amazing like mixing and programming room in the house, which wound up being perfect, as you can guess, for the last couple of years we've all been through.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Criteria when you were looking for a place, must have a room that can be used as a studio?
Yeah, well, it's funny because previously I'd been based in Montreal for 7 years before that. And part of the reason I moved there was because you could get big chunks of real estate for cheap. It's kind of like a Berlin in North America. For those who don't know, hello everyone. By the way, I'm originally Canadian. I lived in New Zealand as a teenager, but my parents are British, so I came up through studios in the UK. Hence my messed up, confusing accent. So yeah, so I basically built my career in London and was like, this is all a bit crowded, and was looking for a change. So I wound up going to Canada, and you can get all of this space. So I wound up building my dream studio in Montreal, which was in a really cool area. It was like, 600 square foot control room, and a live room, and an echo chamber, and a private kitchen, all that kind of stuff. So had to kind of condense it down when I moved down here, but decided to just stick it in the house. And there's a whole bunch of other reasons behind it. But yeah, anyway, we had a great house. And funnily enough, a little tangent, we might get onto this later, but the guy who actually had the house before me, who built this studio, he's a very, very talented acoustician and techno producer, but we're actually building a startup together to solve some issues for music people, but we'll get into that. That's still early stages.
I look forward to that. You just did a little bit of a bio about yourself, and I might take this opportunity also to tell you a bit about you. Before I do that, though, I just wanted to start by acknowledging the custodians of the land on which I'm sitting today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are watching this today. Right. Now, about you. So, Damian Taylor, producer, mixer, programmer, songwriter, engineer, 6 nominated, founder of Complete Producer Network, a CV that includes working with Prodigy, Uncle, The Arcade Fire, Björk, The Killers, a little bit of local Aussie flavor, songwriting with TJ Mazer and Odette. So there is a lot to get through. So thank you once again for joining.
It's a pleasure to be here, buddy. Yeah.
Hey, so as a starting point, I mean, I think if I understand this correctly, you kind of came up in music like a lot of people started playing. I think it was piano and then trumpet school and all that sort of stuff. And then, if I understand correctly, at the age of 16, you sold a mountain bike to buy a 4-track. Why?
Well, basically, I mean, I went through the whole formal music system, which was great. And by the time I was 14, I was playing every single lunchtime and after school was a band practice or a symphony practice or whatever, which was fun. But I suddenly realized, like, I hate this music. So just suddenly, like, went up to my music teacher and was like, I'm stopping everything. At that point, I was, playing quite a few different instruments. And then I took a year off, but just got really into buying records. And, really got into music in a big way. If there's any from the younger generation who are on this stream today, you used to have to go and work a job for what for me would have been about 6 to 8 hours worth of work in order to afford to be able to buy an album of around 10 songs from an artist you like. So I would work like any hours I could would work and would spend all my money on records. So I basically just, really became obsessed with music and really got into like, well, these are the records I like and they have this kind of a characteristic. And started just reading sleeve liner notes and stuff. And then wound up, my parents actually moved to Saudi Arabia when I was 15, and I moved up to Auckland in New Zealand to finish off high school. And, met some people there who played like instruments I liked. And so I started playing bass. And basically, a friend of mine just said, oh, there's this thing called a 4-track. Because this was also before the internet, by the way, folks. So you'd have to have someone who'd heard about something who would tell you about something, and then you go and check it out. So anyway, so I just thought like, oh, recording sounds cool. And sold my mountain bike and bought a 4-track basically.
Right. What were the records that you were buying? What were the records?
Well, I was a teenager when grunge was happening, so I kind of, for me, the kind of foundational records are a combination of like golden era of hip hop. So in particular, like Public Enemy's "Fear of a Black Planet" is still one of my favorite records of all time. And then, like early Smashing Pumpkins and weird records that were coming out of the UK by bands like the Faith Healers and early PJ Harvey and stuff like that. So kind of a combination of guitar bands and a bit of hip hop. And then a year or two later, that started turning into stuff that was happening like with Moax and Warp Records. So the kind of more weird crossover, like art club records kind of thing really captured my imagination. And that kind of cemented me wanting to move to the UK.
Right. Just, 4-track.
Sorry, Rob, you just cut out a little bit there, buddy.
I'm sorry. Talking about that 4-track. Can you hear? Yeah. Did you then just dive straight into that world?
Yeah. I mean, as like living in the basement of this elderly couple in Browns Bay in Auckland, and was just recording stuff and kind of messing around, and saved up a little bit more, and I'd got a bass and then bought like a really cheap guitar, and then eventually after I moved out from living with them, I bought a drum kit and stuff. But I really just got into sitting there with a tape machine and kind of you'd write a little riff and you go ding 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 ding, and I'm like a terrible musician, by the way. But was also like, working out all my teenage angst and stuff. So I was, that whole process basically helped me realize that, to cut a long story short, that I really liked the process of making a record more than I was necessarily like an artist. And if anyone who's heard me sing would be like, yeah, Damian, that's definitely like, you're way better on the production side. You're much better behind the scenes. But, and there's just something about that kind of lesson of, sometimes you do just have to lock yourself away in a room and mess around for a year or two and see what happens. And that was kind of what happened there. And that definitely got me to a point where, I saw that there are these people on record sleeves called record producers, and I just knew that's what I wanted to do.
And that's why you then went to the SAE?
Exactly. Yeah. So again, my parents were British, so I was very lucky to be in a position where they just, went to the consulate and got me a passport, and I hopped on a plane. And yeah, because they'd been living in Saudi Arabia as well. They're always like, when you finish high school, I stayed in Auckland for another year, but they're like, yeah, we'll put you on a plane if you want to go somewhere, and flew off and stayed with some family friends for a month, and then just found a room in a cheap flat in Brixton, and was lucky that there was a guy in the studio there who replied to one of the 42 CVs that I sent out. So just managed to get my foot in the door of a studio that was literally in a guy's living room in Brixton. And basically really just got into making records in the UK and the whole British culture, both with musically. What was amazing as well with the UK is that people were there from all over the world. I wound up living in Brixton, so there's an amazing, like, especially having lived in New Zealand, like African culture, Caribbean culture, just, everyone was over from Europe. So really feeling like as in a melting pot full of people from around the world, and just hearing all these new sounds. And you could, there's all kinds of crazy like club nights just going on in Brixton. My kitchen actually overlooked the stage door of the Brixton Academy. So again, if anyone's like in the Antipodes, it was like, for me living there, I just would walk back to my flat after the studio, and there'd be a big sign. It'd be like, live tonight, the Prodigy. And so like bought a ticket off a scalper and just, went in and saw the Prodigy play and stuff like that, and listened to, the Verve play while I was having a bath. It was pretty just amazing being in a place where like everything was happening. So
yeah. After arriving in, you came up with a songwriter and producer.
Sorry, you're still just cutting out a little bit there, buddy. Can you get a little bit closer to the mic?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was asking how long UK were you? Did you team up with Guy C?
So that was, so basically this, that was, I mean, I'm incredibly lucky. It was only a year after being there that I met Guy, and that was at this same studio in Brixton. So my dream when I moved to the UK, as a side note, I'd done an audio engineering degree in New Zealand when I was there, and wound up working in a studio for a year there as well that did more stuff for TV. But yeah, my dream was to either get into Strong Room or Abbey Road as like an assistant. So none of them would reply to my emails or anything like that. By then, I think we had email. So there's this one studio in Brixton, and that was just literally like anything that came through the door. I think they advertised in the back of Sound on Sound magazine. It was like 15 or 25 pounds an hour. But it was actually an incredibly well-equipped studio. So they had 24 tracks of tape machine, 48 tracks of ADAT, and a 16-channel Pro Tools system. And because I'd been working in the studio in New Zealand that did stuff for ads, they wouldn't let me in the studio during the day but they would get me to put like, you know, footsteps on, do Foley and sound design stuff after hours, or they'd get like a sample CD in audio and say like, okay, chop up all these toms for their samplers. So I'd started messing around a lot with digital audio very early on. And because this control room had a Pro Tools rig in the corner, one of two times that an external engineer came in, they had some guitar parts that had been sent over from the States from David Torn. And yeah, so I did a bunch of editing and flying stuff around. And the engineer on that one session knew Guy from a different project, and Guy had just been looking for somewhere cheap to mess around on Pro Tools. He had a bunch of ideas that he wanted to explore. This was still at the point where like a 16-channel Pro Tools rig was like a big deal. And he came into that studio and we got on really well. And around that time, I'd been there for a year. So I was starting to feel like, oh my God, is this a dead end kind of situation? And I was looking at buying a secondhand ADAT machine off the owner and getting a job just washing dishes or something and trying to just hustle it and go and record bands in rehearsal rooms or something. And anyway, Guy came in, we got on incredibly well. And at the end of our 3-day session, he just asked me, or no, sorry, I asked him if he had any advice on going freelance. And he was just like, oh, well, I've got another session coming up and I'd love to work with you again. And why don't we just work together? So I became kind of his right-hand person for the next couple of years. And it was a perfect encapsulation of the non-linearity of music careers. So it went from not being able to get in anywhere, no replies to anything, and then going and working with Guy. And it's like the next day you're kind of working with your heroes. You know, like literally the first thing we did together was at Strong Room in Studio 3. We did a remix for Talvin Singh, and then the next thing was working with Uncle, and you know that was part of the whole Moax crew, which had been hugely influential. And then you know shortly after that, working with Björk. So it was kind of wild.
Yeah. What did you learn from
Guy? I mean, Guy was. It's funny. He is just so intelligent and such a deep thinker about music. So in many ways, I feel like I learned everything from him. I don't think that's an exaggeration. Every single lunch break, every single dinner break, he would basically just talk about music. Guy's incredibly well studied. Like he went to the Amsterdam Harpsichord Academy when he was young. He read music at Cambridge. So he had this ability to intellectualize and break down music in a way that's kind of unlike anyone else I'd met. So, but he also, you know, would drive around in his Mini and we'd be scanning through the radio stations and listening to what's going on the pirate radio. So if you imagine someone scanning through pirate radio in London and then like using an Oxford kind of, or a Cambridge musicologist brain to break down what's happening. So there's his whole, I mean, if I had to sum it up with one thing, like his attention to detail is like just off the charts. And he had these ideas about achieving a degree of precision in audio that was kind of hitherto, you know, had never been tapped. And I was able to translate his vision into a reality in Pro Tools. So really, with him, it was like a way of zooming so deep into the fabric of sound and then being able to rip it apart and use that very creatively. So when we started working together, he had a project with Imogen Heap called Frou Frou. We were working together on the early stages of that, early stages of Björk's Vespertine. We did a whole bunch of stuff together. And, you know, on that record, it got to the point where it was literally just using pencil tools to draw waveforms into a blank screen. And so it was really an amazing feeling of just like, oh my God, we can do anything with sound. But yeah, he also had perfect pitch. So he would be literally going, I think that snare drum is 7 cents sharp. Could you tune the snare drum down 7 cents? And, you know, we were making sure just like individual oscillations of waveforms on hi-hats were like syncing up perfectly. So it was is interesting as well because, you know, much as time went on, it was almost like that was the way of being able to achieve like a degree of perfection in sound. And then, you know, the next phase of my career became like, how can I kind of pull it all apart and start to very deliberately mess stuff up? You know what I mean? But yeah.
When did that start for you? That desire to start messing stuff up?
Well, actually, does everyone remember Right Said Fred, I'm Too Sexy?
Yeah.
I did not work on that record, but the guy who produced that amazing character called Tommy D, who's in London, and I was doing some programming for him. And I was, you know, in his studio working on some beats, and he comes in and goes, "Oh, all right, darling. Oh, that sounds lovely. But that snare, can you just move that forward like you know, 10 milliseconds or whatever. So he introduced me to like pushing stuff off grid. So with Guy, it was like everything is hyper locked. And then Tommy was all just like, close your eyes, man. Like God gave you a groove. It's in your heart, kind of thing. So that really got me thinking. And then there's actually a bit of a seminal record, which no one really heard. There's a guy called, what's his last name? David Silver, I think, who was in a band called Fine Young Cannibals, but he had this project called Fried. And it was kind of like a cross between early Wu-Tang and Motown. And so we were just, you know, he just had me over all the time to kind of chop stuff up and kind of program beats. And that record was when I just got like super deep into nothing is ever on the grid, but we're placing it with the same degree of precision, if that makes sense. So it's still kind of like programmed and stuff, chopping around and sliding, but just, you know, really trying to explore time in a different way. But fundamentally, if there's one person who actually really pulled me out of, or like really pulled me out of the paradigm I was in with Guy, even though it was very complimentary, was actually working on the Prodigy. And so I learned so much from Liam Howlett, from on a completely different point of view. Because Liam's stuff in the Prodigy, it's like just it's fucking attitude. Do you know what I mean? And everything is like really kind of raw and intense. And Liam would just be looking over my shoulder and be like, "What the fuck are you doing, man?" And I'd be like, "Oh, I'm just putting a little fade on there." It's like, "No, fuck that off. Just like fucking just bosh it in." Just, you know. And anytime I was like, "Oh, we'll just like do this nice little nuance thing here," it's like, "No, just fucking," you know. So he really taught me to be like really kind of brutal, and messy in the right way. And don't get me wrong, like Prodigy stuff is probably some of the most dialed records I've ever worked on. Like we spent at one point on Always Outnumbered, Never Outgunned, we spent 5 days working on a kick drum and a bass line before throwing it away. But his whole thing about like something like, if it's coming in, it just comes the fuck in. Do you know what I mean? We're not going to spend like 64 bars. Here's a little detail and here's a little detail. To like, if something is happening, then it needs to be able to kind of bang you over the head and really grab your attention. Yeah. So that was, you know, I've been lucky to work with so many different people and kind of get these different perspectives.
And you've always had to be to those perspectives, which
Always
is interesting.
Always had to be what, sorry?
Open to those perspectives.
Yeah, totally. You know, because really, like, what I mean, I consider myself a record producer and not a producer, and that was always my goal. But if there's a career strategy I deployed, it was to actually be useful to people and help them achieve what they needed to achieve. And you know, even though I had a couple of lucky breaks early on, I still more or less came up through the traditional studio system, which is where you have clients, you know what I mean? And they're not coming to me being like, "Oh, Damian, just, you know, wave your arms around and get all creative on us," even though, you know, I brought a lot to the table, but it was really like, how can I help this person achieve what they want to achieve? And funnily enough, like I had when I was working at that studio in Brixton, that was the, you know, the biggest point in my career where I wasn't choosing who I was working with. It was just literally whoever came through the door. And you wouldn't always like the music that came through the door. You know what I mean? And so when I was there, I really, sometimes I'd love stuff, but other times I'd just be like, oh my God. But I decided quite early on to really think about, what is it that this person loves about this song? What is it that this person loves about this style? And I'd really try to understand where they were coming from, rather than being like, oh, it's not my thing, like they can, you know, take a hike or whatever. But also, like when I was working with Guy, there's a few really key moments which were quite transformational for me, where, you know, this wasn't, I'm trying to remember who we were working with at the time, some band, but we all really loved what was going on. And then Guy was like, no, well, we've got to do this other thing, or he really wanted to try something out, and he kind of shoehorned something in and kind of forced it on us. And in the end, I was just like, oh yeah, he was right. You know what I mean? So that really helped me to stop thinking that I knew everything about the record. And then this happened over and over again working with Bjork, where it was like, I don't know where the hell she's going, but like, I trust her. And then at some point, sometimes, you know, a few hours into a session, sometimes months after something start, it would all lock together and you just be like, oh my gosh, okay, I get it. So really for me, you know, I'm in a position now where I get to work with, I'm relatively selective about who I work with. So I really look for people that I'm inspired by as artists and who I trust as artists, and who I'm kind of like ready to follow wherever they want to go.
Right.
And that really keeps it interesting.
Well, I mean, you Björk then, and I think Vespertine was the first record that you worked on. And then you had a lot of like working on the several albums.
Yeah, well, actually, technically speaking, I did a few edits on Dancer in the Dark. So if anyone's seen that film, she commits a murder and then her record starts skipping. So that was, my edits on there. And that was like quite symptomatic of the stuff that Guy and I were messing around with. And it is worth saying that Guy played in Björk's bands and he was very influenced by her as well. So her influence was very broadly reaching. And then, I kept in touch with her management for the next 6 years, and then they pulled me in to work on Volta. So I worked with her more or less start to end on that, more or less. And it's worth saying, like, I'm a record producer now, but at that point I was an aspiring record producer. So Björk was the producer of her records, and I was like her, I called it her sonic butler or sonic midwife. So, her engineer. So I was there to facilitate what she was doing. So, I just want to be clear when people say Damian's a record producer, I am. My credits do include Björk, but Björk was a producer on her stuff. So and then after that, but at the end of Volta, she invited me to play live with her. So I was her musical director, and played live electronics in her band and did a whole world tour with her, which was phenomenal, especially after being in a small windowless room with a couple of dudes for 10 years. And then we did the whole project after that, Biophilia, together. And that was another great thing about that role with her is I would then work with her with whichever collaborator she was working with. So everyone from like Timbaland to Elgin Show to Mark Bell would just kind of go in and facilitate those sessions as well. And then really just working with her was a phenomenal adventure. Like we traveled the world. She never just wanted to do the same thing twice. She was always trying to figure out how to make things interesting. So, we wound up in Puerto Rico on a beach for 7 months. We wound up in Mali in Africa, all over Iceland and, New York. So it was really an amazing blessing working with her.
How do you got those incredible experiences when you end up back in your studio working with other artists? Is there part of you going, if this was with Björk, I'd be in Mali? How do you
Well, actually,
all right.
Not at all. I mean, it's funny, like, when you're working with artists who are like really established and are very deep in their career, it's an amazing opportunity. But there are so many factors that they're having to deal with. So, there's always like a combination of factors. And when I wound up doing nearly 6 years with Björk full time, by the end of, from Volta to the end of Biophilia. And so it was really exciting for me after that. Like I built my studio in Montreal by then, and new artists would come in and it was their first record. And the only thing they're thinking about is, does this sound great? And just, so being able to really just focus on the purity of like, all we're thinking about is this record, was wonderful. And sometimes, having those deadlines and that budget constraint actually forced a bit of creativity.
Right.
So it's very different. It's a little bit like, you wouldn't go to Uluru and be like, well, it's not Bondi. Do you know what I mean? Like, you really have to like love everything for what it is. And in many ways, I think just having had that experience with Björk was such a gift, because it's like, I feel like, okay, I really have been able to see the world and travel the world and done like the coolest things with like, and really kind of, I think, proven myself. Biophilia in many ways is like the most avant-garde record of our generation, and I learned Max MSP for it. So I felt like I didn't really have anything to prove anymore, but in a very liberating way. And I think that really helped me open up to really listen to what the next generation of artists that I was working with, because really after working with Björk, suddenly like I was older than my artists for the first time, whereas when the start of my career, I was like the youngest person in the room for quite a long time. And so that was really a nice transition. But then it's also, it helps me get really excited about, like Odette, for example, when I work with her, to me, like she is 100% Björk level as an artist. And so it's exciting to be involved with someone at a different stage in their journey, and see it kind of come to life, at a different point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I apologize for I think it's a bit chunky, but you mentioned that embracing, I suppose, that you've always had a thing to embrace technology and new ways of thinking. What's exciting at the moment about what's coming? Technology.
Technology. I hope this isn't too frustrating an answer for people, but I'm actually very excited about blockchain technology. I'm very excited about the future of the music industry. And 100% everyone, we're on a Jaxsta live stream. So, and they have not asked me to say this, but just seeing where there is the infrastructure emerging for us collectively as music creators to get our stuff out there more and more and more directly. And more and more easily. Like in 2008, I remember like wanting to start a record label and thinking like, oh my God, how wouldn't it be amazing if I could like sell music to download? And I just remember like searching all over the internet, trying to figure out how the hell to do that independently. And there just weren't the tools. But really specifically, you know, the potential for blockchain technology, smart contract technology, for where that could get the music business in like 5 to 10 years. That's what I'm most excited about. I'm actually, you know, in the studio. I'm sorry if that's like a frustrating answer for people. I'd love to say like there's this dope new synth, which is, you know, but I'm actually, as much as I embrace technology now, kind of a couple of years ago put in a like I don't give a shit about more gear, kind of an embargo mentality, because I'm just so focused now on finishing the record and extracting the message from the artist. And yeah, I feel like in music tech and music production tech, computers are getting more powerful, which is great, but I'm trying to, you know, I try to keep across it to a certain extent, but I don't, you know, the transition from analog to digital was just like a profound shift. There's so much cool stuff out there, but yeah, I feel like nothing is exciting me as much on a technological level. For me, it's all much more like artistic ideas and what the artists are doing. But okay. I mean, the fact is, like, I'm sitting in a room in my house, and the capabilities in this room are just like mind-boggling. Yeah. It's really easy to take it for granted, but I have like this one computer, and it can replace what a whole big ass studio that would have cost millions of dollars could do. And you know, as a result of other stuff I've been doing, like through the pandemic, I've been streaming a lot on Twitch and trying to, you know, really help other people in their musical journey, quite sincerely. Just thinking about ways that we can kind of communicate and share ideas, and really understand what the essence is that makes a great artist or a great piece of music. Because I also, you know, spent a lot of my 20s and a good chunk of my 30s trying to justify my presence in a room by being really, really clever with what I was doing with the technology. And I was never really stopping to think like, what's this song about? You know, or I don't know if you really, do we need this 8 bars here? So it's, yeah. So, I mean, all that stuff is still in my DNA, you know what I mean? And that's actually been the fun thing doing all the Twitch streams as well, is like the things that I don't really think about anymore are so embedded that it's like a fish doesn't notice the water that they're in. Kind of. Yeah.
And is that what inspired the Complete Producer Network?
Well, that was, yeah, it was all pretty organic how that grew. And funnily enough, in 2019, I was in Sydney working with Odette on her last album, Herald. And then my dad had had a brain tumor early in the year, and we found out that he had some surgery, but found out it came back. So I was like, okay, I better pop into New Zealand to check in on him. So I went there and then wound up staying for 4 months. So he passed away, so I looked after him in the last few months of his life. And being back in New Zealand, actually in the same town we lived in when I was a teenager, a town called Nelson, which is in the South Island, really got me thinking about what it was like wanting to build a career in music, but not living in London or New York or Los Angeles, you know what I mean? And just remembering like that feeling of trying to figure out where I could put my energy, knowing how much passion I had for it. And I was just thinking at that point, okay, I really need to rethink what I'm doing with the internet, because I'd literally let my own personal website lapse, and I'd stopped, you know, I mean, I never really got that into the grams or anything like that. So when I came back and then the pandemic hit, I was like, okay, this is my chance to figure stuff out. But ironically enough, I found out about streaming because my son and I play video games a lot. So I would like watch like YouTube videos about sick gaming setups, and then the YouTube algorithm started feeding me stuff about streaming. And so, yeah, so I started watching this one channel where they review stuff and then talk about how to build a stream. So I was like, I'm going to just try this live streaming thing. So I set that up, and it was just, it wound up being the very kind of genuine conversations that you could have with people were really interesting. And I was starting to see that people didn't have to just hire me to work just on their record for me to be able to help them. Like I could kind of offer some feedback and some perspective that was proven to be very useful for people. And then if anyone who's on the Twitch world or the gaming world would know, everyone has like a Discord server. So after I've been on Twitch for a bit, people were like, oh, yeah, you got to have a Discord server. So I set one up, and then within a week, I was just like, this just makes my brain hurt. This is like, it's like, you know, text messaging on meth or something like that. And I can't have like a meaningful conversation. So I started looking for a different way to create a new community platform that kind of reflected the values that the community that was forming around the stream had, which is fundamentally just like everyone everywhere in the world has a voice that's worth hearing, and music is a phenomenal channel to get a message across. And if we can learn how to use all this technology that's around us, if we can kind of empower ourselves and support each other in this, then we can get some great stuff out into the world. And, you know, and that became like really kind of an overwhelming kind of driver for me, being able to help people in this way and creating a context for people to connect that was outside of, you know, the broader just internet. I'm going to say toxicity. We'll take that with like a huge pinch of salt because I love the internet. But, you know, a lot of the kind of primary places where people discuss music production would be overwhelmed by a few loud voices telling other people they'd done it wrong. Right. Or that you couldn't do it unless you had this one particular gadget or that particular gadget. So I wanted to set somewhere up where you'd have to apply to join. It's all free and everything like that, but there wouldn't just be an open door for any, you know, drunk dude off the internet to wander in and start yelling at us, and where I could boot people off if they were being a sexist pig or whatever. And so that's really how the Complete Producer Network started.
But what you mentioned at the beginning, that you're also working on another startup. What can you tell us about that?
Okay, so that one's really fun. It's called Sonica. If people go to sonica.app, you can sign up for the wait list. And basically, that one started, I was having a big chat with Noel Jackson, who co-built this, well, not co-built, he built this studio and I took it over from him. And we were just talking about the kind of pain points that we had as producers. He also is, he's like very involved in building the internet. He like kind of was really involved in like the first wave of blogs when he was like 12, but then also made music. So really, really fascinating guy. And I was just talking about the fact that, you know, oh, my manager will phone me up and say like, hey, I just had this meeting with someone and can you send us some tracks? And I was like, no, I don't know where the hell my damn songs are. I know where all my artist projects are, but like I have like a hard drive with like hundreds of songs and I don't want to take the time to have to go through them all. And we were just talking about how tough it is keeping track of all of your ideas. And then on the other hand, this whole thing where like, it's basically what you guys would solve with Jaxsta, which is like, you have new records coming up, but now do I need to like hire a web designer every single time like something gets released? So we're just talking about this overall thing about like, we work on all these ideas. We have like this intellectual property portfolio, to use like business terms, that we're building all the time, but we're not, I'm going to use a serious business term, we're not exploiting. So it's like basically those of us making music, it's like we pour in so much energy into all this stuff. And if we had a little bit more structure around it, then we could help our projects connect a lot more. We could share our stuff a lot more successfully, but fundamentally we could get our ideas to the point where they're finished records a lot more easily. And because by this point in life, I'm like 100% a record producer, like my fundamental role is helping people finish an album. Like, let's deliver a record. So I started thinking a lot about how people in music could benefit from a framework, not just help them track their ideas, but plan what the next steps are, and work with a team to get stuff done. So there's a lot of nuance to it, but fundamentally what we want to do is just help you track all of your ideas from the initial spark through to delivery, through to release. And we have a really, really compelling roadmap about you know, the next few years, how that can be built out, going from just like, I need to keep track of the beats on my computer, all the way up to we'll be able to work with management teams, labels, promo people, and have a central place where we can plan and get our stuff out in the world. I mean, basically, you know, it's a really, really, really exciting time to be creating music. And if you have your shit together, pardon my French, you can do stuff completely independently and be very successful. And by successful, I mean actually like make a living, not like bitch at Spotify because they're only giving you 0.0004 cents a stream. And don't get me wrong, I think that sucks. But if you really keep control of what you're doing, then you can build a pretty great business. But there are just endless fiddly details to keep track of. And as someone who is making records day in and day out, like those fiddly details just eat up creative energy. So we want to really kind of build a support system for creative people, for their ideas, that can help them focus on being creative, help them focus on finishing that record, and help them focus on getting it out into the world.
Wow, that's amazing.
So Sonica.app, I know that's a very broad overview, but you know, it's the other thing, like as a record producer, when people hit me up and they want to work with me, it's like just even the pain in the assness of just sharing a simple playlist with people. You know what I mean? If like I get sent a Dropbox link and you're clicking on stuff and it plays half the song, then your phone goes into sleep mode and then the song stops and then you can play one song but then not the next, and then, you know, SoundCloud, oh, the link didn't work this time, or private doesn't work on mobile. And but even just like creating a SoundCloud playlist, if you're making it, it's like half an hour or an hour of like uploading stuff, and it's, you know, so we're thinking about a lot of stuff like that.
Wow,
yeah.
That sounds amazing, and look out for it. But Damian, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you so much for chatting.
Nice one, Rod.
Everyone, check out completeproducer.net as a starting point. Check out Jaxsta.com. All about music credits and lots of music credits in general. Back to 221 million official music credits. So visit Jaxsta.com. And Damian, thank you so much again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Anytime. Thanks for having me, Rod.
All right. Bye-bye.
Cool. See you later.